We left off last week with Paul in the house of Philip the evangelist in Caesarea, and he was preparing to leave to go to Jerusalem. And one thing I didn't get to mention at that time when we were in Caesarea and in Philip's house was that Agabus the prophet had come to Caesarea and was telling them something they already knew, that Paul already knew, because he had said, and Luke had recorded for us in the return trip on his way back to Jerusalem, that the Holy Spirit had been testifying in every city that bonds and imprisonment awaited him there. And so Agabus comes and tells him, you're going to be bound like this, and you're going to be led away. And so we've had all of these prophecies that tell Paul, you're going to be imprisoned. And there's nothing you're going to do about this. This is what is going to happen. And Paul knew this. Paul said he was ready to die if that was what was awaiting him in Jerusalem. And so at the end of where we left off last week, he was preparing to go back to Jerusalem. And so we pick it up as he's on his way back to Jerusalem to face whatever's going to happen here. Now, it's interesting when you read through Acts, maybe even really starting in Acts 20, and then on to the very end of the book of Acts, it is almost like an action movie. What we're really going to be looking at here are a lot of different events that are occurring in the life of Paul, and that are kind of going from one significant event to another. There isn't a whole lot of theology here. Some of the things that Paul says, he's said in a lot of different places. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into a speech before the group that was there when he was being hauled up by the Romans before they tried a second riot and tried to stone him, and maybe there. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about what he says before the Sanhedrin, because these are all things that we've heard. The things that he says, we've heard before, and he kind of just repackages them. So I don't know if we want to spend a whole lot of time, although there's some points from those that I do want to bring up. So we're going to be kind of looking at the different events that are going on and maybe draw some ideas from that. Now, again, we have up where we stand in the timeline, and here we are in 57 AD, and after the conclusion of all the missionary journeys, and we're moving towards the early 60s, and you can see here that what we're going to be covering this week and next week actually covers a great deal of time and a great deal of events. Paul's going to be in prison for 2 years in Caesarea and then another 3 years in Rome. And so basically, from this point on, as far as we're concerned with Paul, he's going to be in prison. Now, maybe it's not prison as we quite think about it, although I wouldn't say that prisons of that time were exactly the best and most comfortable conditions that were available. But because he was somewhat in protective custody to a degree, he was allowed a lot of latitude in people being able to come and visit him, being provided some provisions, some comforts as well. So it wasn't like he was in a very bare, terrible condition prison, but he really couldn't go anywhere. So he was still confined, and this is not the best of circumstances for Paul. But that's where we're going to see Paul for the rest of what we're concerned of his life here in Acts and through the end of Acts. Okay, so we pick it up here, and in the 21st chapter, and Paul is now in Jerusalem, and he is going to go and deliver the funds that he has collected from the Gentile congregations to the church there in Jerusalem. You remember, he had gone around to the churches as he was departing Asia and Macedonia, where he had been traveling around, and he was collecting funds. Now, what's interesting is because you think about that time, how would you take a large amount of money that you had collected and transport it safely from one side of the Roman Empire to the other side of the Roman Empire? You didn't have the real-time communications that we have now. You didn't have banks where you could electronically transfer money today, and it would be there tomorrow, and it would be there, as far as you're concerned, safely. There was no real ability to move funds around in a way that you could go from one side of the empire to the other without you physically moving it. And if you did that, and we read about this, that the roads that you travel on are not necessarily safe. So how do you take a large sum of money and move it around the Roman Empire such that you keep it safe and deliver it to its ultimate destination? Well, the way you do that is that you acquire a large traveling party. And the people that were traveling with Paul were there to protect Paul, especially in the different roads that he was going to travel on in the different places. And so that discouraged people from attacking you and stealing the money, because it would be a large enough group that a band of robbers would think, well, that's just not what I want to deal with. But think about the people that he had acquired with him. Who were the people that were traveling with him? Most of them were not going to be Jews. They were going to be Gentiles, and they were still with him here as he entered Jerusalem. And if we read here in the next few chapters of Acts, we see here that's going to lead to a problem. And people are looking to find a way to have a problem with Paul. And it's going to be immediately confronting Paul whenever he gets here to Jerusalem and he meets with the elders there. Now, he arrives in Jerusalem, and he immediately goes and he meets with the elders of the church in Jerusalem. What's interesting here is that it doesn't mention another apostle being there. We have James by name being mentioned and the other elders being mentioned as a group, but not a single apostle. Anyone have any ideas about why that may have been the case? That the last time it was the apostles and the elders that were meeting in Acts the 15th chapter. But why no apostles now here when Paul's back in Jerusalem a number of years later? Any thoughts, any ideas about why that may be the case? So I think that's, we don't have anything that tells us. But one of the things that we talked about in this is that Jesus gave a command. He gave a mission statement that we were to go into all the world and we were to make disciples and we were to spread the gospel. And one of the things that he said they were supposed to do is go to the ends of the earth. We know that different apostles through secular history ended up in a couple of different places. And it's very likely at this point the apostles have actually kind of scattered from Jerusalem. Some of them maybe because of the persecution that has occurred, others fulfilling the missionary statement that Jesus made to go to the ends of the earth and make disciples. But whatever the case is, it doesn't appear that apostles are really now still in Jerusalem. They are out, and they are making disciples towards the ends of the earth, which would be really at this time the ends of the Roman Empire. So for whatever reason, no apostles by name are mentioned here. Perhaps there's some here. Perhaps they are among the elders, but you would think you would at least name those men. But whatever the case is, the apostles are not there, but the elders of the congregation meet with Paul. And Paul, it says, begins to recount all that God had done among the Gentiles. Let's see here. What do I have? I don't have any of these, do I? No, one of them. Okay. When we read in Acts, and say we go back to Acts the 14th chapter, and it says, and when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And again, in Acts the 15th chapter, when they're here in Jerusalem, it says, when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they declared all that God had done with them. And in Acts the 15th chapter, later, when they're all in this meeting where they're trying to decide, it says, and all the assembly fell silent and listened to Barnabas and Paul as they related what signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. It's interesting here, and I think this is something that's instructive for us, that Paul, pretty much in every time that he's relating what has happened, he's saying what God had done through them. Who has Romans 15? Romans 15. Okay, let me get a mic over, Grant, over here in just a moment. So, we again have a letter written by Paul. And he says in Romans the 15th chapter, what does he say, Grant?
In Jesus Christ, then, I have reason to be proud of my work for God, for I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I have fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, tough word there. Thank you. Appreciate that, Grant. So again here, he's writing this gospel, and he says, I'm proud of my work for God. and that I am not venture to speak of anything except what the Gentiles is accomplished, or Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience. Everything that Paul has done, he ascribes to the power of God. He does not say, look what I've done. And Paul has done personally a lot. But he's doing it because God charged him. Maybe go back to the road to Damascus. And he's going to talk about that when he's talking to the group that was, the mob that had been, for the moment, silenced. But he's going to talk about that. It was his habit, and it's clearly his habit from the beginning, to give the glory and ascribe the glory to God. And we should learn that in all good things that happen to us, when we are trying to spread the gospel, whether we are out there actually, quote unquote, evangelizing like Paul would be when he's preaching, or we're just in our day-to-day walk, exemplifying God and bringing others to God through the way that we act, that personal evangelism that occurs not just because you say, this is what God says, but the way that you live that causes someone to say, why are you different? We need to learn to ascribe it to God. And there's nothing wrong with us always making sure to give God the glory. And Paul here gives us an example of someone that at every turn gave God the glory for what was being done. And so, as we see here in 21, as he's describing the different places and the different cities that he is spreading the gospel to, we can see that he gives the glory to God. And then we get this picture here of him going city by city and saying, well, in Ephesus we did this, and in Corinth we did this, and in Antioch of Pisidia we did this, and we had great numbers of people that obeyed. And you can get this sense from the Greek there that he's describing it in detail, city to city. And as that assembled group of elders listened to what Paul said and about the spreading of the gospel, they glorified God. So Paul gives God the glory, and then they turn around and glorify God because of the great success that Paul was having in the gospel. Now, there are issues here that are about to be addressed among the congregation that are coming in because of false teachers that stem back to Paul. But the elders here realize that Paul is doing a great work. And again, this is an example for us. People should always recognize that no matter what someone is doing in the work of God, it is always because there are other people back there that are supporting them. I'm sure the evangelist here would tell you they need the support of this congregation to be able to do the work that they do. That the elders here, to do the work that they do, need the support of the congregation here. All of us need the support, and all of us who are in different roles need all those other roles that are going on in the church to be able to make it all work together. And sometimes some people are seen out in the front, and it seems like they're the ones getting all of the attention and perhaps, quote unquote, the glory. In reality, they should always be reflecting that to the one that ultimately should be given the glory, and that is God. It is through the power of God and through the grace of God that we have that. But we should look at their success. When it's a success for God in bringing people to the gospel, and realize that we should be joyful and happy, and that we should glorify God because of their success. Their success is our success. We had Brother Scholz here not too long ago. He's over in Africa and doing a very hard work there. And you listen to the things that he had to say about the challenges that he faced, and you realize that we have it comparatively easy. Now, we have our own challenges. There are challenges that he faces. We face an entirely different set of challenges. But the success that he has, we share in. Now, we don't maybe share as directly as some of the men that we directly support in this congregation, but we do send support his way sometimes. And individuals I know end up supporting him. And so I guess one of the things that we find here is there's no place for jealousy in God's kingdom. And seeing the success of somebody else in spreading the gospel and the work and the conversions and the stuff they're doing, because we're all sharing in that. that's where we want to end up. We want every person in this world to come to a knowledge of God. And so these elders rejoice with Paul. Yes, there are challenges because Paul is now here, and that's going to bring challenges. But God's work among the Gentiles is glorious. And everybody should be rejoicing there because of it, and they do. And so they hear all of these successes, and then they give the glory to God, and then they say, Brother Paul, look here in Jerusalem. Look at how many of your fellow Jews have obeyed the gospel. And so the work that you're talking about among the Gentiles, we give glory to God for, but give glory to God because here in Jerusalem we have many that have obeyed. But, and this is a big but, they're zealous for the law. Now, I think as Gentiles, which is what we are, we have a hard time here understanding. We I think, we're so far removed from what the law is and the cultural aspects of it, and the church has become predominantly Gentile by our time. In fact, probably by this time it's heading that way, if not that way. That I think sometimes we look back and we say, well, how can these Jews continue to hold on to these aspects of the law when they've got Christ who has completed and fulfilled the law? And how can they be so zealous for the law when that's not necessary anymore? But what we forget is that it's a culture, it's a way of life. It is their nation. It is who they are. They identify with it. And so it is very difficult to remove yourself. And there's nothing necessarily wrong about a number of the traditions and the practices in the law. The problem became in how they were saying you needed to be saved and how it applied to the Gentiles. But we now have a flashpoint developing. Paul is back. And the charge that's brought against him is that you have been telling all of these Jews that live out among the Gentiles that you do not need to follow the law. And of course, I think we've read Acts, and that's not what Paul is saying. Paul has not told the Jews, abandon the law, give it up, and live like Gentiles. He never said that. He's never said that. Now, he's made it absolutely clear that the law is not the way to salvation. Only Jesus Christ is. And only through Jesus Christ can you achieve salvation. But this was a flashpoint, and you have among the congregation there, the vast majority, if not almost entirely, of that Jewish congregation in Jerusalem, these type of people. And so Paul comes in, and they say, you realize there are people that are spreading these things, and all of these people have heard about it, and they kind of believe it, and now they're going to hear that you're here, Paul. And that's going to be a problem for us. You've got to do something about this. And so we have a problem on their hands. The elders there. And I think this is another thing that just tells us. Here are elders of a congregation that are looking out for the flock that is among them. They have a very serious situation that is developing that they have to deal with. They have to live day to day with all of these people in Jerusalem that they are trying to reach out to. And if they cause unnecessary problems with these groups of people, how will their evangelistic outreach actually be effective? And they've got to think about, we got to live with these people. Not only do we have to live with the people that are outside of that we still need to reach, how do we live and keep unity in our congregation? And so the elders there are faced with a situation where they've got to figure out, how do we keep the peace both inside our congregation and allow us to continue to reach out and bring those that are still among the Jews who have not believed into the fold of Christ? So you can, I think, sympathize with these elders here and understand they have a difficult situation. I think that tells us that sometimes the elders in congregations have difficult situations, and many times we don't always understand as members all of the facets that go with it. And I think it tells us that all of these men, I think the men here, and I think the men through history that have served in general and as elders, the men who serve today as elders in this congregation and others, are doing their level best to look for ways to continue to do God's word and protect the flock that's among them. And sometimes it's a very difficult job. And these men had a difficult job here. Now, so that sets forth what's going on in the congregation. Let's look here a little bit what's going on just broader in the Jewish community. So this was a time of intense Jewish nationalism and political unrest. And there was one insurrection after another, and it challenged the Roman rulers. And Felix, who's basically the Roman governor at this time, and Paul's going to go see him here in very short order, brutally suppresses all of these uprisings. He's doing what the Romans do. We're going to keep order, and we don't care what we need to do to keep order. If you're going to step out of line, we're going to suppress you until you get in line. And they will bring whatever pressure they need to bear, and Felix definitely did it. Not only that, you have among the Jewish people itself, you have this very pro-Jewish sentiment. And if you were seen as being friendly to the Gentiles, well, that's a problem. Okay? So, Paul, where have you been, Paul? You've not been in Jerusalem. You've not been in Judea. You've been living among the Gentiles. And that's an issue. I mean, these are things that are just all coming together. And you can see how a socio-political environment can have its impact upon a church. I mean, we live in a time with a lot of unrest, and it has an impact upon the church. And you cannot disregard that. You have to understand the times that you're living in. I see Aaron over here. Thanks, Titus.
Wanted to expand on that. What was really interesting is that during this time of the Jews opposing Rome and Roman rule there, the nations around Judea sided with Rome largely.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the groups of Jews, the Beth Shammai, wanted to cut off all trade with the surrounding nations as a result of that. So they were effectively going through an economic embargo of the surrounding nations. Another group of Jews opposed it. Beth Hillel opposed it. But then the Zealots came in and sided with Beth Shammai. So effectively you had this group of people who were not only ultra-conservative, but then they were radicalized by allying with the Zealots, who were known for carrying out the assassinations against Roman sympathizers.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's that's going on. There's these group of. In fact, that's what this Roman tribune is going to be like. Aren't you this Egyptian over here that's caused some problems for us, that escaped when we got his group, but he escaped? I think you're him. Well, it turns out he's not. Oh, but you have all this going on, and Ananias, who's the high priest, is kind of involved in all of this and is going to meet his demise with some of these groups as well very shortly. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So this is a very charged environment. We're leading up to the first revolts against the Roman Empire that lead to eventually AD 70. This is all coming. We're not far out. We are on the cusp of it. It's already begun in many ways. This is an extremely volatile, extremely unstable environment. The church is existing in it. It's trying to do its job of evangelizing. And Paul is doing God's work, but Paul is a magnet for trouble. You can't ignore that. This Roman tribune we're about to deal with, it's got to be pulling his hair out, because how is this guy? And remember, here's the crazy thing. You think about Paul, I don't think sometimes we realize Paul was a short guy. And I think from some of the things that we can see in Acts is that sometimes Paul had a bit of a short temper and was willing to go off and say what he thought, and not always maybe thinking about, well, what are the ramifications going to say? I think the Sanhedrin, I don't know, may have been that, I don't know. But not that Paul was right in what he said. I don't want to give the impression that I think he was wrong. So all of this stuff is going on. We've got to do something about it. This backdrop's playing out here, and so Paul comes in. We got to do something as the elders. And you think about this, the charges that are going to be brought and the charges that are being made against Paul, they sound a lot like the charges made against Stephen in chapter 6. Some of the same things. And who likely was making those charges against Stephen? We know Paul was consenting to his death. Was it Paul? So here we are in 21, and it's potentially the very same charges, not all. There's some differences. But many of the same charges, same one that Stephen was drugged before the Sanhedrin and ultimately stoned. And so there's a bit of truth mixed in with these, just like they were with Stephen, but mostly they've been made up. So the elders have already devised a plan. And that plan is to take 4 men who have already taken a Nazirite vow, and they're going to complete their vows in the temple, but they're going to need to offer sacrifices, and it's not cheap. So a standard practice among the more wealthy to show their piety was to pay for the poorer people who were doing it. I believe Agrippa did this for a bunch of people, Herod Agrippa, is to pay. So he says, okay, Paul, here's the deal. Go pay for these people. You purify yourself ritually because you've been among the Gentiles. You go ritually purify yourself in the temple. Pay for these men's sacrifices, and no one will question the fact that you still believe the law should be followed. Okay? Well, that raises a question for us. Maybe. What about Acts chapter 15? Well, we've just had Acts 15. Or not just had. Many years ago, we've had Acts 15 in the narrative of Acts. For us, it's just been a short few weeks. But for them, it's been a number of years. You have Acts 15, where they all agree you don't have to do this to be saved. And we all know that. You understand. You didn't need that. That group of meeting there, that wasn't making policy for the church. They were trying to combat false teachers coming out of the Jerusalem church, and it was right for the church to say, we disavow this. We're not saying this. But it isn't the church going, well, we're going to make policy on the way to this. No. This is the way it was. And I want people to understand, Acts 15 is not a model for the church to be able to say, this is policy, we're going to make it, and this now affects the church. That's the way the Roman Catholics do it. That's what other churches do. That is wrong. From the beginning, it was not so. That people had to obey and adopt the practice of the old law to be able to be saved. But you have here Paul being put in a situation where they're saying, to look like you support the law, we need you to do this. Now, I think Paul does believe in keeping it. He was coming back for a feast. And so a lot of commentaries take a lot of issues with Paul, saying that now Paul is denying his teachings on salvation by grace. And I would say to that is that they have a totally skewed view of what salvation by grace really means. But a lot of people say Paul should never have done this. He was compromising on his principles. And I think we have a comment up here. Paul should never have given in. And he should never have agreed. But there were a lot of other things that were going on here, and I think Paul needed to help out. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I think what we get from the text is they're twisting what Paul has done. Like you said earlier, he hasn't said that Jews should not keep any of these traditions.
No.
In fact, we find in Acts 18, he's getting a haircut. Why is he doing
Nazirite.
that? Because he took a vow.
Yes.
Presumably,
Probably
just like this vow.
Yeah, we're not sure. Yes, absolutely. We skipped over it, but he himself does this. Paul very much still follows most of the aspects of the law, from what I can tell, pretty strictly. He's going to make his defense in the Sanhedrin here in just a minute. So I'm a Pharisee, zealous for the law. And even the elders then turn around and tell you, hey, look, we're not going back on what we said in Acts 15. We all still agree for the Gentiles, but you've got to help us here. We've got to live among these people. And this is doing us no good favor if we just blow it all up and then we're left with the pieces. And how do we continue to evangelize? And that tells you, you got to live among the population that you're in, and you got to find a way to evangelize. And blowing it all up is not the way to do it. Now, there is such a thing as not compromising. But how do you, and it's a tough one. How do you not compromise, but yet still make yourself acceptable for the population you live in so they will still listen to you? It will do no good. If by the end of all of this, the Jews, and I think, well, the end of this is unfortunate because the Jews are going to bring this upon themselves, but you got to still be able to reach out to the people, the community you're in. Because if you can't, what good are you doing? And I think the elders here are put in a difficult situation. And so Paul here doesn't seem to be upset about this. He doesn't seem. I think Paul, we know Paul, he would have told you what he thought. If he thought you were compromising, he was very clear when Barnabas did it, and he was like, I can't believe that Barnabas is doing. And when Peter did it, he told him to his face what he was doing was wrong. Paul clearly is not a guy who's shy of saying, that's wrong, there's no way I'm doing this. But Paul was willing to bend when it was necessary and when it didn't conflict with what he believed God wanted him to do to make himself more amenable. 1 Corinthians 9. Who's got 1 Corinthians 9 here? Okay, back over here. And so in 1 Corinthians 9, this is what Paul says.
To the Jew I became a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I may win over those who are under the law. Okay,
thank you, Parker. So, to the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. And then, and he goes on there. And I think he said the same thing about the Gentiles. Look, is Paul going to blow it up here? No, he's not. But is Paul going to compromise? Absolutely not. But Paul realized this was a course of action that was Now, we know the outcome of this. This is doomed to failure. Doomed. Because clearly there are people in Jerusalem that have come from all over the world, and we know there are people in these cities in Asia that absolutely hate Paul viscerally because they have stirred up riots in city after city in Asia and have gone after him. These Jews want him dead. And since it's a feast time, they're here, more than likely. Now, we know they're here because we read on and we find out they are absolutely here. But they're after Paul. They want to get him. And they're not going to be stopped by anything they did. So no matter how well-intentioned the elders' plan was, it was going to fail because these people over here weren't going to let it. They weren't going to have it go away. So we move on, and Paul does what they ask him to do. And sure enough, verse 27. We find in verse 27, there are Jews from Asia there. And they've been waiting. You get Paul's like, it's almost there, end of 7 days, I'm going to make it out, and back to the temple. And that's where it all goes sideways for him. And clearly, these Jews from Asia were looking for an opportunity. They were looking for Paul. They know who Paul was. They could identify Paul. They could see him here. And so they see him here, and they see these men that they can identify from those cities that are Gentiles with them, and they either jump to a false conclusion or just go ahead and they don't care, not even jumping to a conclusion. They just have decided this is the case, and they don't care about what reality is. And they say, there's Paul, get him, because he's telling people to abandon the law, and he's brought these Gentiles into the temple. Now, the first charge that they make was the one the elders were concerned about. Hey, Paul's telling the Jews all out where we live, you need to abandon the law and live as a Christian and live as a Gentile. That was what the elders were concerned about. And remember, in Athens, Paul had taken a direct shot at the temple of Artemis, and he wasn't shy about what he thought about, these things that were made with hands that God didn't need. And so we're in close, relatively speaking, to AD 70. We are close. The temple is going to be destroyed. We are not far away. in 57. 13 years. A lot of stuff's going to transpire in the next 13 years that bring about Romans' utter destruction of Jerusalem. And it's just beginning. Okay, so the second charge is really the one that's most damaging. And in that second charge, they're saying he's bringing people into the temple that are Gentiles. Now, here's the thing about that. This was an extremely serious charge because the penalty for those Greeks would be death. And the Romans had given special dispensation to the Jews to execute anyone that went within a certain boundary that was a Greek or a Gentile. Didn't matter if they were Roman citizens or not. They gave them special dispensation. You can execute them. So it was serious. And along the restricted area, which would be the court of the Gentiles, there were signs, which we in fact have one. This is one of them. We have excavated it in archaeological digs. And that sign says, in Greek and Latin, and they were spaced all along the balustrade of the court of the Gentiles, that says, no stranger is to enter within the balustrade round the temple and enclosure. Whoever's caught will be himself responsible for his ensuing death. This is the end. And Paul's drug away, or is about to be, is in the process of being drug away, to be executed for what they believe is a serious violation of the law. I mean, he's profaning the temple by saying that you don't have to be here, and this temple is made with hands. It's nothing, and don't live like a Jew. Live like the Gentiles. And by the way, he brought in these Gentiles. We know who they are. They've gone inside these balustrades, and so he's worthy of death. All of them are worthy of death. And so they're dragging him away to do that. But, this is where the Romans get involved. Outside, just right on the edge of the temple, there is the Antonia fortress. And you can see it here, up here. It's right up here. There's the Antonia fortress right there. And here's the inner courts. Gentiles can be in here. These are where the balustrades are, this dotted line here. They can see this area. They see this entire thing devolving very rapidly. And they are able to do that. Now, the thing about it is we're in a feast time, so they have fortified this city. They have put a larger garrison in the Antonia fortress specifically for events like this. They were ready for something to go. They knew there was potential, and they were ready. And so this tribune looks down and sees mass confusion and a riot breaking out and a mob breaking out. So they immediately respond. And it says that it looks like there were at least two centurions that were requisitioned by the tribune, which mean they brought along their units, which were 100 for each centurion. So 200 men came out of Antonia fortress into the temple grounds immediately. And of course, the people drop and they're beating Paul, but they stop beating Paul. But the soldiers are just there to restore order. They don't care. So they grab whoever and say, what's going on? And they grab Paul, and two of them grab Paul, and they try to ascertain what's going on, but of course, no one's really talking, and so it's time to just take Paul back and find out through other means what's going on here. And Paul looks like the guy that's the center of it. So they drag him, and they start dragging him back to Antonia fortress, and at that point, Paul asks to speak to the tribune in Greek. And this is when the tribune's like, well, wait a minute. Aren't you the Egyptian insurrectionist that we're looking for? But you're talking to me in Greek. Now, what's going on here? And of course, Paul says, no, I'm not. I'm not that guy. I'm from Tarsus, and I'm a Jew. Can I speak to him? Now, I don't know what was going through his tribune's mind. He had just seen what had happened. Paul seemed to be the center of it, and yet he lets him talk to him again. Not sure what the tribune's thinking there, but he lets him. And Paul begins his address to the people, and he starts speaking in Hebrew. And of course, when he starts speaking in Hebrew, they all, probably Aramaic, stop, and they go, well, that's interesting, and listen to him. And they listen. What's interesting is they listen until verse 21, at which point he says, and he was told, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. That's it. Riot breaks out again. and they go crazy. And so the tribune, realizing this is pointless, pulls him back in. Now, at this point, he's like, I can't, I don't know what's going on. And the standard procedure of the Romans, flog whoever. Don't have information, flog them. If it kills them, unfortunate, but flog them. They'll tell you the truth. That's at least their thought process. And so they string him up to get flogged, at which point, which is interesting, he waits to that point. He goes, but I'm a Roman citizen. At which point everybody realizes they got a huge, huge problem on their hands, because you can't flog a Roman citizen that's uncondemned. You got to have due process. You can flog any of these other guys, don't flog a Roman citizen. And if you do, and you're a centurion and you flog him, just understand you're in serious, serious trouble if you do it. You yourself could be flogged. So we have the whole discussion about citizenship. Paul says, I was born a citizen, and they realize there has been a grave, grave mistake making, and you see everybody kind of just take a hands-off approach to Paul at this point, because we've already gone way beyond what we're supposed to do to a Roman citizen. We didn't know he's a Roman. We thought he was just somebody else, but he's a Roman. We can't do this. Okay, so that moves us on here to, as I said, I mean, this reads like an action movie, and fortunately, I have more slides on that. It reads like an action movie because, I mean, it moves on from one event to another, and it moves on here to the Sanhedrin. And the Tribune is thinking, okay, maybe I can get answers if I take them to the Sanhedrin and I put them there, and they'll be reasonable. We can have, some kind of procedure, and we can get to what's going on here. So he takes them there, and Paul's put up, and he goes into his first defense, and he says, I have lived in a good conscience up until this moment my entire life. And of course, the high priest, Ananias, has someone slap him because, first of all, Ananias is not a good guy. It is not the same Ananias that we've seen earlier in the Gospels. This is a different guy, a pretty bad guy. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us how Ananias stole for himself the tithes that belonged to the common priest, and he also had his opponents assassinated. So this is a bad, bad guy, and he doesn't care. And he clearly doesn't care. Paul obviously reacts very poorly to this. And we're out of time. I did have Ezekiel and Matthew to be read for this, but I'm just going to skip over that. Sorry, guys. Basically, he calls Ananias a whitewashed wall. And the only whitewashed walls in Jerusalem were on tombs. What did Jesus say in Matthew 23? What did he call the Pharisees? You whitewashed tombs. Now, I don't think that Paul's quoting from Jesus here, because in Ezekiel, which we would have read, Ezekiel talks about the same thing, these whitewashed walls for these false prophets who are saying, peace, 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 bad things aren't going to happen. They were not following what God says. He basically is saying, you're corrupt. You look on the outside like you're a good person, but you're a very bad person. And what you did violated the law, because the traditions of the rabbi say, don't strike a man. And you struck me, and I was uncondemned. And Paul knew the law. That was his training. He was under Gamaliel. So this whole thing devolves whenever next Paul realizes that you've got the Sadducees and the Pharisees there. He would have known that. And he knew the grenade he was throwing in. The moment he said, I believe in the resurrection, it was going to be the end. And truth be told, isn't that the reason that he's being persecuted? What's the answer? Jesus Christ resurrected. That's what we preach. Well, we preach the death of Jesus because that's the only way we can get into a relationship, because we have to have that. But that's the truth of the matter. Now, the Pharisees may not care about that, but it definitely allows him the opportunity to escape and get out. Another confusion breaks out. The tribune has to save him. And so this sets up now the events that lead to Paul leaving Jerusalem and going on to Caesarea. That's where we're going to at the end. We're at the end of class. This is just, one thing after another, so we'll pick it up here as he is escorted out of Jerusalem by an army to prevent him from being murdered.